The click of Danielle's pen cracked through the room like a verdict. With a single stroke of ink, the $200 million contract was torn apart right there in the very boardroom where an entire executive team had been anxiously waiting for their so-called dream corporate marriage. Danielle Carter said nothing. She didn't have to. The paper she had just signed spoke for her. Howard Sinclair, CEO of Skyline American Airlines for 18 years, stood frozen. His face drained of color, as if he had just watched his own empire rip out its foundations in an instant. And in truth, that was exactly what had happened. No one else in the room knew it, but Howard's heart was pounding painfully against his ribs, sweat gathering at his collar despite the ice-cold air conditioning. He stood there hardly daring to breathe, staring at the woman calmly folding the documents, with movements so slow they felt cruel. The woman he and his entire flight crew had dismissed less than 24 hours earlier. The afternoon light spilled through the glass walls of the 39th floor, framing Danielle in a soft glow, serene, composed, silent, like a blade wrapped in velvet. There was no rage in her expression, no bitterness, just an unbreaking stillness, the stillness of someone who knows she does not need to shout to make others tremble. The cold sheen of her Patek Philippe glinted beneath the sleeve of her crimson suit, a symbol understated but unmistakable, the kind that told anyone observant enough that this was real power. Howard swallowed hard, the muscles in his cheek twitching as he tried to force out an apologetic smile that refused to form. "Ms. Carter, I think perhaps we can talk this through." He stammered, his voice thin and pitiful. Danielle lifted her gaze, and that single look made not only Howard, but all 12 senior executives behind him forget how to breathe. She smiled, a thin, almost delicate curve of her lips, not the kind meant to comfort, but the kind given by someone examining a crack in a wall, knowing that one gentle tap could bring the whole structure down. "Of course, Mr. Sinclair," she replied, her tone soft and low. "What would you like to talk about? The cybersecurity system your airline has been waiting 2 years for me to approve. Or perhaps the way your crew yesterday was so enthusiastic about reminding me that I didn't belong in first class." A cold prickle traveled down Howard's spine. The entire room seemed to freeze. The truth was simple and deadly. Howard had no idea. He had no idea what had happened the night before. No idea how close his staff had pushed this deal to the edge of disaster. But Danielle knew. She remembered Lindsay, the blonde flight attendant, standing in front of the priority boarding lane, like Danielle was somehow slipping into a space meant for important people. She remembered Brad, the male attendant, lying straight to her face, that the sparkling water was out, even as she watched him pour it for 3 other passengers. She remembered the dense, suffocating silence as Carol, the senior attendant, leaned in and whispered just loud enough for half the cabin to hear. "First class doesn't seem to suit you. Economy is always happy to have you." And she remembered the captain, stepping out stern-faced, repeating the crew's accusation that she was disruptive and non-compliant. A clumsy performance, a carefully disguised insult. Danielle had seen everything, heard everything, recorded everything, and Skyline American had no idea about the most important detail of all. She wasn't a difficult black passenger. She was the person about to bring them a $200 million contract. She was the CEO of Carter Shield Systems, the cybersecurity giant the aviation industry was begging to work with. And she held far more power than they ever imagined. Back in the boardroom, no one spoke as Danielle placed the file back on the table, opened it, and turned it toward Howard. His eyes fell on the bold heading "Cancellation of agreement effective immediately." His heart constricted. He tried to recover, tried to salvage a shred of authority, tried to stand like the seasoned leader he had been for nearly 2 decades. "Ms. Carter, this is so clearly a misunderstanding. We are deeply sorry for what happened yesterday. It was procedural error. Nothing more, just a mistake." Danielle said nothing. She tilted her head slightly, her eyes sharp enough that Howard felt stripped bare. With each second she looked at him. "Mr. Sinclair," she said slowly, "if your crew's behavior was just a mistake, then why was I the only passenger asked for ID 3 times? Why was I the only one denied a drink? Why, when a 60-year-old white passenger demanded my seat, did your crew find it reasonable to send me to economy?" Howard opened his mouth, but Danielle lifted her hand, barely a gesture, yet enough to silence him instantly. "When they didn't know who I was," she continued, "they treated me exactly how they believed someone like me should be treated. That is not a procedural issue. That is culture, and culture is something you as CEO have created." The silence thickened, pressing down on every person in the room. 1 second, 2, 3. The truth hovered in the air like a bomb waiting to detonate. Panic rose in Howard's chest. He suddenly understood this wasn't about customer service. It wasn't about a few careless employees. This was a fracture slicing through the core of his company, the kind that could destroy a CEO's career reputation, wealth and legacy once the public saw it. And worst of all, he realized, the woman standing before him wasn't angry. She was quiet, and that quiet was far more lethal than any outburst. Danielle closed the folder gently, then locked eyes with him. "Do you know what made me sign that cancellation?" she asked. "It wasn't that I was insulted. I'm used to people underestimating me. The only reason I signed this—" She paused, her smile returning sharper this time. "Is because of the sentence you said as I boarded the plane." Howard blinked. Confused. He had no memory of ever speaking to her. He hadn't been on the flight. Danielle's smile widened, the kind that flips a story on its head. "You told me Skyline American takes great pride in its exceptional service culture. Yesterday your crew proved the opposite, and I do not invest $200 million into a lie. A clean strike, no shouting, no drama. Yet the impact sucked the air out of the entire boardroom. Danielle rose, straightened her suit, gathered her documents, and walked out with the calm assurance of someone who doesn't need weapons to win." The glass door closed behind her, leaving behind a silence thick with dread. Howard stared at the cancelled contract, and in that moment he knew it wasn't just the deal that had died. A part of Skyline American had collapsed with it. Because sometimes real power doesn't need to shout. It only needs to stand up and walk away. Morning in Atlanta is never truly quiet, but the 54th floor of Carter Shield Systems carried a different kind of stillness, the kind of silence that exists only when power is waiting to be unleashed. The grey Georgia sky reflected across the glass walls like a thin coat of paint, waiting for an artist's next stroke. And in the center of that polished space, Danielle Carter stood with her back, straight arms loosely crossed, gazing down at the city beneath her feet. She had flown in from San Francisco at dawn, yet not a trace of exhaustion showed on her face. Most people would need sleep. She did not. Not when a new battle was already forming. Behind her on the desk, her phone vibrated non-stop with emails, statements, and belated apologies from Skyline American. Danielle didn't turn around. She wasn't in a hurry. She understood one truth clearly: those with real power never chase explanations from those who have wronged them. She stayed still until the door opened. Evan Brooks, her assistant, hurried in with a determined look in his eyes. He carried two things: a thick folder and a rising anger he was trying and failing to hide. "Miss Carter, we need to talk. Right now." Evan never called her Ms. unless he was too emotional to stay professional. Danielle turned, her expression softening. "Sit down, Evan." But he didn't. He slammed the folder onto the desk, breathing hard. All night long, news of what happened has been flooding aviation forums. Some are saying you made it up for compensation. Some claim Skyline is being blackmailed. His voice cracked. Danielle studied him for a long moment, then asked, "Are you angry because they insulted me, or because they think I need to prove anything to them?" Evan fell silent. That was exactly what had been crushing his chest. Carter Shield Systems was not a small company. It was the largest cybersecurity empire on the East Coast, where Fortune 500 CEOs lined up for premium security contracts. Government servers, healthcare giants, financial systems all relied on Carter Shield technology. But what made Evan admire Danielle wasn't the $11 billion valuation. It was the brutal path she had taken to reach it. Years ago, as an MIT student, Danielle had gotten used to being mistaken for the teaching assistant, or being asked, "Are you sure you're in the right class?" This is computer science. She would simply look at them with the same gaze that later made entire competitors lose sleep, then went on to graduate top of her cohort. Harvard MBA wasn't any kinder. At her first networking event, an investor asked, "Oh, you must be in human resources." She calmly answered, "No, I build data security companies, and I'll call you after my first 50 million in revenue." The funny part was, she really did call him. And that investor apologized twice. All those memories, all those invisible scars of identity, returned last night when she stood in first class on Skyline American, surrounded by 3 flight attendants and an older white passenger, all examining her documents, as if she were trying to sneak into a seat she didn't belong in. But Danielle never let insults define her. She didn't get lost in anger. She forged it into strategy. Evan inhaled sharply. 3 airlines have reached out already. They want to talk if Skyline collapses. Cascade Pacific even requested a meeting today. Danielle wasn't surprised. Aviation was a battlefield. When one competitor slipped, the wolves always closed in. "Good," she said. "Prepare a list of Skyline's competitors. Not for revenge, for evaluation. I want to know who deserves a real partnership." Evan nodded, though something still weighed on him. "Ms. Carter, I know you're calm, but what they did was unforgivable. I just don't want them thinking you let it go." Danielle walked to the desk and sat down. She touched the edge of the folder Evan had slammed earlier. "Evan," she said quietly but firmly, "I have never let anything go. I simply pick the right moment to respond." A spark flashed in her eyes, and Skyline American chose the wrong moment to insult me. A knock sounded at the door. This time it was Monique Harris, Chief Legal Counsel. At 45, her mind was sharp as a blade, and her courage even sharper. She placed her laptop on the table and opened 3 documents at once. Danielle Monique said, without preamble, "We have 4 possible responses. 1, remain silent, sign the contract, pursue compensation later. Not advisable. 2, renegotiate terms before signing, force minor reforms, retrain their crew." Monique frowned. "Not enough." 3, cancel the contract, issue An official statement damaged Skyline American's reputation. 4. Move to a different airline partner, but this time you set the standard the entire industry will have to follow. Evan looked up. Monique looked at Danielle. Danielle looked out the glass wall, where Atlanta's sky had turned so bright it was almost blinding. When she spoke, her voice carried a certainty that shifted the air. No minor reforms, no apologies, no complimentary gestures. She turned back, eyes burning with unshakable resolve. We are going to rewrite the rules. Monique paused. You mean Carter standards, Danielle said. A full framework for diversity, equity, and customer experience. Binding, measurable, publicly reported. Evan swallowed hard. He had seen Danielle be decisive before, but never like this. You're going to force Skyline to sign that he asked. Danielle smiled. No, I'm going to force the entire aviation industry to sign it. Silence swept through the room. Something shifted. Not the shift of a $200 million deal, but the shift of an entire industry's axis. Evan thought to himself, she doesn't just want justice. She wants history. Monique sat beside her and opened another document. If you're serious, I'll draft a proposal today. But Danielle, this will trigger a massive chain reaction. Skyline will retaliate. Other airlines will panic. The press will swarm. Danielle lifted a shoulder lightly. Good. Change always needs noise. She rose, taking in the whole office, the glass walls, the $11 billion logo, the Atlanta sunlight sharpening every edge. Tomorrow, Danielle said, Skyline American will understand one thing. She tipped her head slightly, her voice smooth steel. If they believe they are the center of the sky, it's time they see the person who can change the entire flight path. With that final line, she turned and walked out, not as someone preparing to sign a contract, but as someone preparing to reshape an entire system. That morning, Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta Airport was not just busy. It was a chaotic river of tens of thousands of people. Yet beneath the loudspeaker announcements, the rolling suitcase wheels, and the relentless footsteps, a strange bubble of stillness seemed to form around Danielle Carter, as if no one quite dared disturb the air around her. She pulled her steel-grey Rimowa, walking with steady, deliberate steps through the crowd like an arrow cutting through water. No noise, no showing off, just a woman who knew exactly where she was going and why. This was the flight that would change the fate of Skyline American Airlines, though they did not know it yet. In Danielle's hand was her boarding pass, first-class seat 2A, Skyline American Airlines Flight SA 482, a seat the airline liked to imagine as practically reserved for the familiar faces, the polished white men in pale blue shirts, silver laptops, and the relaxed, confident smiles of people who believed they naturally belonged there. Danielle knew their looks all too well, the looks that said, "This seat is for people like us, not people like you." She did not hate that. She simply remembered it. At the premium check-in counter, an agent took her passport and smiled with professional warmth. "Welcome, Ms. Carter. We are very pleased to have you with us today." Polite by the book because the system recognized her name, because her company brought the airline more revenue than any single flight. But Danielle understood. A name is a form of power, and appearance is a different story. She signed for her baggage tag, gave a small nod, and headed toward security. No one questioned her. No one scrutinized her. No one had any idea what was waiting for her at Gate B21. A test, a slap in Skyline American's face, a thin, invisible line waiting to be drawn. When she reached the boarding gate, A light breeze slipped along the long corridor and flicked the edge of her cashmere coat. Priority boarding had already formed a neat line, a few middle-aged business travelers, an elegant older woman, a silver-haired man in a blue check blazer on a phone call. Danielle stepped into the line, calm and composed. But one pair of eyes immediately locked onto her. Lindsay Hart, first-class flight attendant, perfectly done makeup, bright pink lips, an expression that looked like customer care, but carried something a bit too sharp underneath. She watched Danielle like a gatekeeper, gauging whether someone was about to cross into a space that did not belong to them. Danielle did not pay her any mind, not until Lindsay walked straight up to her, with a smile stretched tight like a mark. "Ma'am Lindsay," said her voice louder than necessary. "This line is for first class and priority members." Several heads turned. Those looks, those judgments rolled up and quietly thrown at Danielle like small stones. Danielle held out her boarding pass. "I know," she replied evenly. "And I am in first class." Lindsay glanced at the ticket once, but she did not really look at it. She looked at Danielle. "Are you sure you are at the right flight?" "You might be at the wrong boarding lane." A wave surged quietly inside Danielle's chest, not from anger, but from déjà vu. This feeling this way people spoke to her, as if she were the one under inspection. Her eyes hardened. "I know exactly where I am." 2A. The man in front of her twisted around, eyes curious. A woman in a red blazer shifted closer, clearly wanting to hear better. Lindsay still did not back down. "Can I see your ID, please?" Once, twice, 3 times, and the list of white passengers passing through beside her were not checked even once. Danielle's heartbeat stayed steady. She reached into her bag, pulled out her ID, and handed it directly to Lindsay. "Is there a problem with my boarding pass?" Lindsay studied the ID for an absurdly long time, then, with the tone of someone trying to find fault and failing, turned to a gate agent. "I am just verifying something standard procedure." It was not procedure. It was prejudice, wrapped in the excuse of, "I am just following protocol." The gate agent glanced at the information, and her face blanched. "Everything is in order, Miss Carter. You are cleared to board." Lindsay had to step aside, but still threw in one last line, quiet yet sharp enough to cut. "I am just doing my duty." Danielle looked at her and replied, perfectly calm, "Wonderful. I have not started doing mine yet." Lindsay did not understand what that meant, but she would. Very soon. First class glowed with warm gold, wide leather seats, soft LED lighting a faint scent of new oak in the air. The passengers had mostly settled in. Danielle sank into seat 2A, the seat the airline believed belonged to their usual clientele. She opened her laptop. The $200 million deal slides lit up the screen. And then the selective carelessness began. Brad, the male attendant, moved down the aisle serving champagne to every passenger. Seat 1A, seat 1B, seat 1C, seat 2B. He avoided Danielle's gaze like someone avoiding the harsh sun. No glass of water, no greeting, no apology. When Danielle finally spoke, Brad startled as if suddenly realizing, "Oh, she exists. I am sorry. We are out of sparkling water." Danielle looked straight at the tray where 3 bottles of sparkling water had just been opened. "Is that so?" Brad swallowed. "We can offer still water, fine." The water arrived with no lemon, no ice, no apology. And to Danielle that was not just unprofessional. It was a statement, "We do not think you belong here." 10 minutes later, the cabin buzzed with low whispers. A woman in the opposite seat leaned toward her travel companion and murmured, "Maybe she got a free upgrade." "She does not look like first class." Danielle heard every word. She did not react, but each syllable fell like hot metal. Then came Carol Jennings, the senior attendant. Her voice was gentle, but it cut like a velvet-wrapped blade. "If you are feeling uncomfortable with the first-class experience, we can always move you to a seat in economy. Many people prefer that space." Danielle turned her head and met Carol's eyes. "I am perfectly comfortable in the seat I paid for." Carol pressed her lips together. "It is just that a passenger wants seat 2A because that is irrelevant." Danielle interrupted. She did not raise her voice, but something in her tone made Carol straighten up, as if, for one brief moment, she sensed who truly held power here. In the far corner, a white man around 50 in a blue shirt had been watching everything. He tilted his head and muttered quietly, "That is unacceptable behavior." Danielle turned. The man extended a hand. "I am Ryan Delgado. Tech ledger." Time seemed to slow. A journalist, at the right time, in the right place, with the right story. A quick smile flickered in Danielle's eyes, light but unmistakable. "Nice to meet you." She did not yet know that Ryan would become the first spark, the spark that would throw Skyline American into a public firestorm just 2 days later. As the plane began to taxi to the runway, Danielle placed her hand on the tray table, her gaze no longer on the screen. In her mind, the sequence of events lined up. Lindsay suspicion, Brad erasure, Carol pushing her to economy, 3 passengers whispering, the captain about to accuse her of causing a disturbance, a simple equation as clear as 1 + 1, not an accident, not a mix-up, not poor training. It was culture, and culture would pay. She closed her eyes for one brief second, the only second she allowed herself to fully feel the humiliation. Then she opened them again. And in those eyes there was no wound left, only a decision. They were wrong to think she was just a passenger. They were wrong to think she would stay quiet. And they were about to learn just how wrong they were. Night settled over San Francisco like a thick velvet curtain shimmering with city lights. But inside the suite on the 27th floor of the Meridian Grand, everything was silent. Too silent. Silent enough that the sound of Danielle Carter unfastening her heels cut through the air like a blade slicing through a tightened wire. She set her bag on the wide sofa and stood still for several seconds. No thoughts. No emotions. Then came the first deep breath filling her lungs as if she had been underwater and was only now resurfacing. The battle began at this moment, not when it unfolded on the plane. Being treated as not worthy of a first-class seat hadn't broken her. It had made her calculate. Danielle did not cry. She did not tremble. She turned on the lights, opened her laptop, and sat upright at the work desk under the soft amber glow. She looked like someone who had experienced nothing out of the ordinary, but inside a storm was building. Her phone rang. Evan calling. Danielle answered without checking the screen. "Did you get in safely?" Evan asked, his voice pulled tight. "I saw a post from another passenger on the flight. It seems like you. Enough to make Skyline lose sleep for 7 nights if I want." Danielle said, her tone light as a breath. Evan paused. He recognized that voice, the voice Danielle used when she wasn't simply turning the table, but flipping the entire room. "What exactly happened on flight SA-482? He asked quietly. Danielle told him. Every detail, every whispered comment, every scrutinizing look, every deliberately skipped service step, every small flex of power the crew thought they had, all the way to the moment she stated her true identity and watched the entire cabin change color. Evan exhaled sharply, not out of tiredness, but out of fury. That was systemic discrimination, he said. Not personal, not accidental. I know, Danielle replied. What do you want to do? Danielle looked out the window. San Francisco shimmered like millions of characters being decoded. She spoke slowly. I want to know exactly how much Skyline values me. Evan frowned. You mean regarding the $200 million contract? No, Danielle cut in her voice, thin as a polished blade. I mean how much they value my dignity. She ended the call and let herself sink into the sofa, allowing her real emotions to rise for the first time. Not anger, not sadness, but pain. Not because they doubted who she was, but because, after everything she had achieved, MIT, Harvard, an $11 billion company, global contracts, she was still treated as someone who didn't belong in first class. She pressed her hand to her forehead. A brief moment of vulnerability. Then it vanished. She stood up. Danielle Carter never lingers in hurt. She turns it into strategy. Her email notification chimed. She opened her inbox. A message from Vanessa Cole, PR director of Skyline American Airlines. The subject line: We deeply apologize for any discomfort you experienced. Danielle laughed a sound, without joy, without sweetness, like someone listening to an apology so empty it became an insult. She read on, A misunderstanding. Our crew may have unintentionally. We would like to offer 3 complimentary first-class tickets. She closed her eyes. Discomfort, misunderstanding, unintentionally. Words people use when they want to hide the truth. When they are afraid to confront what they caused. When they hope the one they hurt will stay quiet in exchange for a handful of free privileges. Danielle inhaled deeply. She clicked, New message. To Evan Brooks. Subject: We escalate. Evan, contact Monique. We proceed with option 4. Also call Cascade Pacific. Call Liberty Coast Air. Skyline is not our only option. They must understand Carter Shield technology waits for no one. Less than 5 minutes later, her phone buzzed. An unknown number. Danielle answered. Miss Carter, this is Ryan Delgado from Tech Ledger. His voice was firm, clear, observant. I want to confirm something. Is it true you experienced discriminatory treatment on Skyline American, Flight SA 482? Yes, Danielle said simply. I have spoken to other passengers. I have also reviewed the airline's internal complaint history. This is not the first time. Danielle stayed silent, a calculating silence. Ryan continued. If you allow it, I want to report this story with full context, but the timing is entirely your decision. Danielle replied, Wait until after tomorrow's signing meeting. What do you think the CEO of Skyline will do? Danielle looked out the window, the city glowing below like a secret circuitry network. Mr. Delgado, she said quietly. He has no idea who I am. Ryan's voice lowered, which is exactly why I want to see how they react when they find out. After the call, the suite sank back into silence. But this time, it was not the tense silence from before. It was the stillness of someone preparing to strike. Danielle stood, walked to the desk and opened her laptop. She ignored every glossy slide Skyline had prepared for the contract signing. She created a new slide instead. One line, bold and white, centered on a black screen, the Carter standards. Then she typed, An industry does not change because of apologies. It only changes when it is forced to. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes sharp again. At that moment, a soft knock sounded at the door. Room service with dinner. Danielle thanked them, but when the door closed, she stayed still for a long time, staring into the mirror in the suite's foyer. A powerful woman stared back. Not a victim, not someone who had been insulted. A leader, someone who could shift an entire industry. And in her reflection, there was no pain left, only resolve. Before going to bed, she sent one last message to Evan. Tomorrow we are not going to sign a contract. We are going to rewrite Skyline's future or end it. She set her phone down and turned off the lights. San Francisco still blazed outside, but inside, darkness settled gently over the woman, carrying a world that was about to tremble. And she slept peacefully because she knew she did not have to outrun the storm. She was the storm. That morning, pale blue daylight spilled over San Francisco, but on Skyline American Flight SA-482, an invisible storm was building by the minute, and Danielle Carter, seated in 2A, could feel it more clearly than any AI system her company had ever designed. The plane had been in the air for nearly an hour. The metal wings sliced through thin layers of cloud, leaving long white trails across the sky like strokes of a pen. The first-class cabin glowed softly under warm LED strips. Everything looked perfect if you ignored the tiny cracks spreading out from certain looks and certain deliberate lapses in service cracks only someone who had lived with them her entire life would recognize instantly. Danielle opened her laptop, but the words on the screen, the numbers, the charts, the project timeline all blurred in her mind. Not because she was tired, but because of the strange silence hanging over the cabin. A silence that said something. The second round of drinks began. Brad, the male flight attendant, pushed the service cart toward row 1A. His voice was smooth, polite, textbook perfect. Champagne or sparkling water, sir? The silver-haired man in the first row chuckled. Champagne, of course. Brad filled his glass, moved to the next seat, then the next, then to 2B, the seat right beside Danielle. Still, he did not look at her. He did not speak to her. It was as if she were an invisible gap in the row. Danielle waited, giving him a chance to show whether this was truly accidental or simply another move in what had begun back at the boarding gate. Brad finished serving the row, rolled the cart to the end of the cabin, and began to stow items away. Danielle pressed the call button. The soft ding rang out, gentle, yet in the quiet cabin it sounded like a warning. 1 minute. 2. 3. No one came. Danielle pressed it a second time. This time the ding felt as sharp as a blade. At last a different flight attendant. Caroline Jennings, the same one who had suggested she move to economy, walked over. Her smile was hard to read, part forced, part probing. Is there something you need? Danielle answered simply. I was skipped during the drink service. Caroline's eyes narrowed just slightly. Brad is responsible for first class today. I will. She stopped mid-sentence, pressing her lips into a smile as thin as paper. Remind him. There was no apology, no hint of acknowledgement. She turned away. Less than a minute later, Brad appeared. But instead of professional composure, he stood beside Danielle's seat with the pinched expression of someone being forced to do something he did not want to do. What can I get you? He asked, a trace of irritation clinging to his voice, as if Danielle had inconvenienced him. Danielle replied in a calm that was almost frightening. I want what any passenger is offered, like they were. She tilted her head toward the 3 sparkling champagne flutes gleaming on the other passengers' tables. Brad exhaled, strained and tight. What do you want? Cheese, plate, wine. Water, cheese, plate, and Cabernet. He nodded and turned away, a faint red flush of anger passing over his cheek. A few minutes later he returned, placing the tray on Danielle's table harder than necessary, making her water glass tremble. No apology. No eye contact. He walked off, as if fleeing a mistake he had been caught in. A man in his 50s, seated diagonally in front, leaned over and lowered his voice. I have flown in first class for more than 12 years. I have never seen anyone treated like that. He held out his hand. Ryan Delgado, Tech Ledger. Danielle shook his hand. It was not a long handshake, but long enough for Ryan to realize this was not just another passenger. Her gaze was too sharp, too calm, too controlled. Ryan thought, she knows exactly what she is doing, and she knows exactly what is about to happen. He sat back down, opened his tablet, and began typing, but the play was not over. Caroline returned her smile, now looking like a thin mask starting to crack. "Madam," she said in a voice loud enough for the entire row to hear, "it seems you are not comfortable with your seat." Danielle's brow furrowed slightly. "I never said that." "No, of course not," Caroline shrugged. "It is just that one of our VIP passengers wants seat 2A. He has sat in this seat for 15 years. Danielle lifted her head. A sharp flash lit up in her eyes like the edge of a blade. "I do not care who he is. I paid for this seat." Caroline bit back a laugh. "We are only trying to create the best possible experience for our loyal customers. Many people." She let her gaze travel slowly from Danielle's head to her feet, would feel more comfortable moving down to economy. No one would judge them for that. Each word dropped into the cabin like stones hitting the surface of still water. A quiet that is too much floated from seat 3C. Danielle held her composure, but her breathing grew just one beat heavier. She took out her phone and pressed record. Caroline saw it, and her smile tightened again, like a violin string pulled too hard. "You are recording," Danielle answered softly. "I record what I need to remember clearly when I speak with someone who is actually in charge." "Are you threatening me?" Caroline asked, her expression changing color. "No," Danielle said. "I am protecting myself." At that moment, a silver-haired man walked up. Frank Miller, the VIP, who was sat in 2A for 15 years. He stood right beside Danielle's seat, his voice full of self-defined authority. "Young lady, is there a problem with you getting up? I need my seat." Danielle looked up at him. Her eyes darkened. "Your seat, I do not see your name on my boarding pass." Frank let out a short, derisive laugh. "You do not understand. This airline always seats me here." "Everyone knows that." Danielle answered each word, hammering down like a nail into wood. "I do not care about your history. This is my seat. I am staying." The entire cabin seemed to stop breathing. Caroline stepped forward, voice sharp. "If you continue to be difficult, I will call the captain." Danielle turned slightly her tone, dropping to something dangerously low. "Do it." 5 minutes later, the captain emerged, face stern, posture rigid. He glanced at Danielle, then at Caroline, as if he had already heard a version of the story that did not include all the facts. "Madame," he began, "the crew has reported that you are not cooperating." Danielle cut in. "I have cooperated. I have followed every rule. I have done nothing wrong." She pointed to her phone. "I have a full recording of our conversation." The captain frowned. "Recording crew members is against company policy, and discrimination based on race is against federal law." Danielle replied, slowly, cleanly with weight. A current of electricity shot through the cabin. The first person to speak up in her defense was Ryan. "I can confirm," he said loudly. I have been watching from the beginning. The crew has treated her very differently." The captain's expression changed at once. A journalist, a witness, a public relations risk. He drew a slow breath. "Your name, please." Danielle looked straight at him like a verdict waiting to be read. "Danielle Carter, CEO of Carter Shield Systems. I am on this flight to San Francisco to sign a $200 million contract with your airline." The cabin exploded into a deafening silence, a silence full of shock. Caroline went pale. Brad froze at the back of the cabin. Frank stepped back as if someone had slapped him. The captain swallowed hard. He understood. He knew. He recognized the disaster. His voice dropped. "Ms. Carter, I sincerely apologize. Of course you will remain in your seat." Danielle said nothing. She just looked at him. And in that look he felt himself shrink inside the very pilot uniform he had once worn with so much pride. As he backed away, trying to patch the situation with a weak smile, Danielle spoke only one sentence. "I look forward to our meeting tomorrow morning." The captain understood the message. Skyline American had just dug a hole deep enough to bury its own reputation. The flight continued, but no one in first class dared breathe too loudly. Brad served Danielle with perfect form from that moment on. Caroline never came back to her row. Frank sat rigid and silent, and Danielle pressed the save button on her recording. Inside her, one clear thought surfaced. Tomorrow I am not just coming to sign a contract. I am coming to demand justice, and Skyline will pay for its rotten culture in full. The San Francisco sky was stretched tight like a drawn string, and the headquarters of Skyline American Airlines, a towering block of glass and steel on Market Street, gleamed in the sunlight as if it were innocent. Inside, the people running the airline knew the opposite was true. Today would be anything but peaceful. Danielle Carter stepped out of the black SUV in a crimson power suit, the red sharp as a warning signal. Evan Brooks and 3 senior leaders from Carter Shield walked behind her carrying documents and laptops, their faces drawn tight, like wires on the edge of snapping. Danielle had no need to act forceful. Her silence alone was enough to make people step out of her way as she passed. The moment she entered the main lobby of Skyline American's headquarters, the reception desk went instantly quiet. One staff member shot to her feet, so fast her chair almost toppled. "Ms. Carter, they the conference room. It is ready for you." Danielle gave a slight nod, her gaze never lingering on anyone for more than a second. She was here for one reason only, and it was no longer about signing a contract. The elevator opened onto the 42nd floor. The doors to Skyline's largest conference room stood at the end of the hallway, frosted glass, etched with the airline's logo in polished gold. Evan leaned closer and whispered, "They are scared, you know that, right?" Danielle answered softly, without looking at him. "Yes, but fear is not enough." She pushed the door open. The entire room froze. A long ebony table stretched out like the hull of a ship. 12 members of Skyline's executive team waited there, all in expensive suits, their faces so tense it looked as if new lines had carved themselves into their skin in just a few hours. Howard Sinclair, the CEO of Skyline, jumped to his feet the second he saw her. His face had gone pale, and the smile he forced out made his lips tremble. "Ms. Carter, we appreciate you giving Skyline the opportunity to." Danielle took the central seat and opened her laptop. "Let us begin." Her voice was not cold, but it was enough to make a row of powerful men swallow hard. The meeting unfolded as if everyone were trying to pretend no storm had just swept through Flight SA 482. The financial directors presented the deal terms. The chief technology officer outlined the rollout plan for Carter Shield's AI platform. The PR head talked about the media campaign for a historic $200 million partnership. Danielle listened, calm, her back straight, one hand resting on the table's edge, the other holding a pen. But in her mind, everything was as clear as light through a microscope lens. When the CFO finished his last slide, every eye in the room turned to Danielle, waiting for her nod, waiting for her to save them. Danielle took a small sip of water. The room seemed to hold its breath. Then she set the glass down. Gently, yet in their heads the sound rang like a judge's gavel. "Before I sign anything," Danielle said, "there is something I need to share." Howard inhaled sharply. Panic was written plainly on his face. The room shifted, not because of any breeze, but because everyone felt themselves being dragged out of their comfort zone. Danielle opened the black folder in front of her. "You want to know what really happened on yesterday's flight, do you not?" Howard blinked. "Ms. Carter, I have seen the internal report. It was only, do not say, a misunderstanding." She fixed him with a stare, her eyes cutting through the shell of complacency he had worn over 18 years as CEO. Silence swallowed the room. The head of marketing stopped mid-note. The CTO put his pen down, his hand shaking slightly. Danielle began to recount it all, every detail, every word, every moment in which she was treated as if she did not belong in first class. Her voice was steady, not shaking, not angry, not playing the victim. She simply laid out the facts, and those facts were so heavy that the entire room felt like it was sinking into the floor. When she described the moment Carol suggested she move down to economy, Howard placed his hand on the table, as if he needed to hold on to something to keep from falling. The breaking point was when Danielle said, "And when the captain threatened to remove me from the flight, I had no choice but to say my name." Howard froze. A new wrinkle etched itself across his forehead. Danielle continued, "Danielle Carter, CEO of Carter Shield Systems." His attitude changed immediately. She looked around the room. "So I want to ask all of you this. If I were not a CEO, if I were not the person about to sign a $200 million contract with Skyline, if I were just another black passenger in first class, what do you think would have happened?" A tightness rose in the throats of several people. No one dared answer. Danielle closed her laptop. The click sounded like a prison door locking. "Your problem is not customer service, and it is not a few bad employees. Your problem is culture," Howard whispered. "Ms. Carter, we are prepared to discipline them." Danielle's lips curved slightly. "Firing 3 people will not fix a rotten system." The sentence made one of the executives suck in a breath like he had just taken a punch to the chest. Danielle pulled a thick stack of documents from her bag, placed it on the table, and slid it toward Howard. On the cover, it read, "The Carter Standards, a comprehensive framework for equity, culture, reform, and passenger experience justice." Howard opened to the first page. His eyes trembled. What is this?" Danielle's answer fell with the weight of a verdict. The conditions under which any airline will be allowed to partner with Carter Shield. Inside the document were systems to monitor passenger experience by demographic mandatory unconscious bias training at every level, transparent reporting, and independent audits targets for diversifying the executive board within 18 months, diversity-based KPIs tied directly to leadership compensation, and a discrimination reporting hotline with mandatory response service levels. Howard whispered, This would force us to change the entire company." Danielle tilted her head. "Exactly." The CFO flushed red. "But $200 million is already a very large amount to attach these kinds of." Danielle placed one fingertip on the document, her gaze locking onto him. "The contract is now $250 million. Shock rippled through the room. Even Evan turned to stare at her eyes wide. Danielle continued, her tone sharp as a blade. "But 20% of that will only be paid once Skyline meets the Carter standards. And Carter Shield will have the right to internal oversight." Howard shot to his feet. "Ms. Carter, this is the price of respect." Danielle stood as well, her crimson suit a slash of fire across the room. "The price of repairing a culture that has rotted. The price for me to even consider working with you." She collected her laptop and swept her gaze around the room one last time. "Skyline has two choices. One, continue as you are and lose the strongest security platform in the industry. Two, adopt the Carter standards and become the first airline in America to carry out real reform." Howard's voice cracked. "You want us to decide right now?" Danielle walked toward the door. "I do not need your answer right now. I need it within 24 hours. Her hand rested on the door handle as she turned back, her eyes ice cold. "And if you refuse—" She paused for a beat, 3 heartbeats in the room, dropping like stones. "Then Cascade Pacific Airlines is waiting." And they had no hesitation at all when they heard the words, Carter Standards. Danielle left the conference room. Evan followed his heart, pounding like war drums. And Skyline American, a massive airline conglomerate, was left facing a terrifying truth. The woman they had dismissed on yesterday's flight was now demanding that they change their entire corporate culture. And the most frightening part was not her demands. It was this: they could not afford to say no. A storm does not always need thunder. Sometimes all it needs is a silence deep enough to warn that everything is about to explode. And Skyline American Airlines had just stepped into that silence. The first message arrived at 6:42 p.m. Evan Brooks was sitting in his suite at the Meridian Grand papers scattered across the table when his phone lit up. Ryan Delgado. "Story is up. It's going viral." Evan stared at the words, a shiver cutting straight down his spine. He opened his laptop and loaded Tech Ledger. The homepage flashed with a headline, bold enough to split the sky: Black CEO, discriminated against on Skyline. Flight 200M contract frozen. By Ryan Delgado. Evan swallowed what little air remained in his lungs. "It has begun," he whispered. 11 minutes after the article went live, Twitter erupted. Then LinkedIn. Then Reddit. Hashtags ignited like sparks in a dry forest. Boycott Skyline Carter Justice, Flying While Black Reform. The sky's hidden stories began to rise to the surface, like shipwrecks dragged from the ocean floor. Dozens of past passengers shared similar experiences, on Skyline being asked for ID, 3 times being questioned if they were sure they were in the right seat, being pushed down to economy, despite having paid being served slower than others. Stories once buried in silence, now burned alive under the flame of Danielle Carter's name. 7:12 p.m. Evan exhaled sharply when he looked at the stock ticker. Skyline American SLA 3.4%, not a catastrophe yet, but only the beginning. A minute later, the first public comment from a well-known tech CEO appeared. Had the exact same experience on Skyline last year. Time for accountability. Then a famous model. Then a market analyst. Then a politician. The storm was unstoppable. While the media blazed on the 27th floor of the hotel, Danielle Carter sat alone, the warm yellow light casting a strangely serene glow across her face. No one would have imagined that the woman carrying a wave of outrage and expectation could sit this calmly. But Danielle always knew what was coming. She read the article. She didn't smile, she didn't flinch, she didn't tremble. She simply whispered to herself, "It has begun." Evan stepped into the suite, his face a mix of excitement and worry. "Social media is exploding," he said quickly. 3 major corporations just announced they're reviewing their transport contracts with Skyline. "And has Cascade Pacific called back?" Danielle asked. "Yes. CEO Grace Lynn wants to speak with you tonight." Danielle nodded, her eyes sharp enough to cut glass. "Good. It's time they realize the opportunity of choosing the right side." 8:03 p.m. At Skyline American's headquarters, the executive floor had turned into a battlefield. Howard Sinclair leaned against the table, his face drained of all color. Senior executives filled the room, some shouting at PR, others arguing with legal phones pressed to their ears. "We need a statement now," PR shouted. "No, we need a public apology," the marketing chief argued. "Absolutely not. Admitting fault is suicide," the CFO barked. Howard slammed his palm on the table, the sound slicing through the chaos. "Do you think we still have time to argue?" He pointed at the giant screen on the wall, where CNN flashed a red breaking news banner. Skyline American in discrimination. Scandal 200mm contract in jeopardy. Howard inhaled sharply, then muttered through clenched teeth, "We underestimated that woman." Underestimated her badly. 8:24 p.m. The after-hours market began reflecting the damage. SLA 5.2%, SLA 6.0%, SLA 6.7%. Evan stared at the numbers, watching Skyline fall, as if he were watching a slow-motion plunge off a cliff. "It'll be worse when the markets open," he said. Danielle stood beside the window, watching San Francisco's lights stretch like a warped timeline. "Yes," she replied. "But Skyline put themselves here." Evan looked at her, admiration and concern tangled in his eyes. "Do you think they're scared yet?" Danielle turned her gaze bright and razor-sharp. "Not yet. Panic comes first. Fear comes after." 9:10 p.m. A video call connected. Grace Lynn, CEO of Cascade Pacific, appeared on the screen. 49 years old, long black hair, eyes sharpened by more than one battle in the boardroom. Danielle Grace began. "You've triggered an earthquake. The whole industry is watching Skyline and watching you. The industry should be watching," Danielle replied. Grace smiled faintly. "This morning I had an emergency meeting with my board. I want Cascade Pacific to be the first airline to adopt the Carter standards. All of them." Evan's eyes widened. This was a plot twist. He had not expected this soon. Danielle tilted her head, studying Grace carefully. "You understand, Carter Standards is not a technical requirement. It's a full cultural reform." "I understand," Grace said. "And the aviation industry has been slow to change for too long." A heavy silence settled between them. "Danielle, I want to be the first to stand beside you when you launch the Carter Standards. An ally. Someone with real power. Someone who knew what it meant to be underestimated and still rise." Danielle exhaled slowly. "Thank you, Grace. We will do this together." 10:42 p.m. In the dark executive office at Skyline American, Howard Sinclair stood before the window, staring down at the city. Car lights streamed into glowing lines, like the long trail of bad decisions he had made over 18 years as CEO. He whispered, voice breaking, "What have I done?" No one answered. No one could save him. His assistant entered and handed him a phone. "You need to see this." Howard glanced at the screen. A video. Going viral. A passenger on flight SA-482 had recorded Caroline telling Danielle, "Maybe economy suits you better." Howard's knees nearly buckled. Not because of the words, but because of the caption attached to the video. She's the CEO behind Skyline's 200M contract. The top comment was the nail in the coffin picked the wrong woman to underestimate. 11:03 p.m. Danielle received a text from Monique. "They just called me. They want to meet tomorrow morning. Not to negotiate, to ask for more time." Danielle closed her eyes for a beat. Time was what she had given them at the start of the day, and they had wasted it. She replied, "They have exactly 24 hours. Not a second more." 11:59 p.m. Evan watched as Danielle prepared to go to bed, though he knew she would not sleep. She didn't need sleep to fight. She only needed the quiet before the storm. "Do you think Skyline will collapse?" Evan asked. Danielle pulled the covers up, lifting her gaze. Her eyes were both soft and deadly. If they refused to change, they deserved to. Evan nodded, then asked the final question of the night. "And tomorrow, what do you want?" Danielle looked toward the San Francisco skyline, the lights flickering like circuitry preparing to overload. "Tomorrow," she said softly, "I want Skyline to understand that their failure was not just in their behavior, but in the kind of person they dared to underestimate." She turned off the light, and in the darkness, San Francisco still glowed outside, waiting for dawn to break everything Skyline had been trying to hide. Dawn stretched over San Francisco like a layer of silver mist draped across the skyscrapers. But on the 42nd floor of Skyline American's headquarters, no one had the capacity to appreciate it. They were too busy being afraid. Howard Sinclair, his face ashen, like cooled ash, stood by the window, gripping a cup of coffee that had gone cold long ago. Behind him, Skyline's board of directors sat around a table, as long as a runway, every eye locked on the screen where blazing red charts kept flashing. SLA 8.2%, SLA 9.1%, SLA 10.0%. One executive let out a heavy sigh, the sound cracking through the room like metal splitting. "We have lost $75 million in market cap in just 12 hours, the CFO said, his voice on the verge of breaking. Howard did not answer. He knew he was at the center of this collapse. He knew why they were all looking at him that way. At that moment, the door flew open. The board secretary appeared. "Ms. Carter will join the video call in 10 minutes. The room seemed to tighten as if someone had squeezed all the air out of it. One executive almost whispered, "God!" Because they understood once that woman appeared, there would be no more escaping. No more PR. No more spin. Only the truth, and the truth was something Skyline had been running from for a very long time. 10 minutes later, the large screen on the wall flickered to life. Danielle Carter's image appeared, hair pulled back, dark grey, suit eyes, sharp as diamonds. No sign of fatigue, no sign of injury, only absolute control. Evan and Monique sat behind her like two pillars holding up a strategy designed to crush an entire system. Robert King, the chairman of the board, cleared his throat and tried to hold on to his composure. "Ms. Carter, thank you for taking the time to Danielle cut straight through. Have you finished reading the Carter standards?" The heartbeat in Skyline's boardroom seemed to stop. Howard swallowed and glanced at legal. The head of HR was shaking so badly she dropped her pen. Only Robert tried to maintain some semblance of calm. "We are still reviewing them. The document is quite extensive." Extensive. Danielle raised an eyebrow. I call it the minimum. One sentence, but it landed like a sword slamming onto the table. Danielle shared her screen. The display in Skyline's boardroom showed the terms of the Carter standards, large and clear, impossible to look away from. Independent audits of all passenger experience data from the past 18 months. Public disclosure of discrimination metrics. Mandatory training for all 36,000 employees. Increasing minority representation in leadership to 50% within 18 months. Diversity KPIs tied directly to executive compensation. Carter Shield holding an observer seat on the board. The air was sucked out of the Skyline boardroom. Ms. Carter Robert said, his voice stretched thin like a string about to snap, these demands. They are unprecedented. Danielle answered instantly. Racial discrimination should not have precedent either. Yet you have allowed it to occur more than 7 times in 18 months. Eyes darted around the room. Some of them were hearing that number for the first time. Their faces drained as if they were seeing their company honestly for the first time. Howard stood up. Ms. Carter, I sincerely apologize for what happened on your flight, but the Carter standards will fundamentally change how Skyline operates. We need time. Danielle looked directly at him, and that look made him feel as if she were seeing through his executive title and straight into his record. You have had time. 18 years. And you changed nothing. Because you did not see a problem. The words cut straight into what was left of Howard's pride. But what came next was worse. Danielle continued, Skyline's problem is not limited to its cabin crew. It is in its leadership, in its culture, in you. Howard froze. The boardroom went still. Robert King took a deep breath and then said the words no one expected to hear. We received Mr. Sinclair's letter of resignation this morning. Howard snapped his head toward Robert, eyes full of fury and desperation. Robert, we agreed that Skyline needs change, Howard. And it starts at the top. In that moment, Danielle understood. Skyline was no longer in a position to resist her. They were too weakened. They had reached their breaking point. Robert turned back to the screen, his demeanor now stripped of any illusion. Miss Carter, the board has been in emergency session since 5 this morning. We have unanimously agreed that Skyline will accept the Carter standards in full. Evan tightened his fist under the table, forcing himself to stay composed. Monique allowed herself a satisfied smile. Danielle's expression didn't change. Robert went on. We have also agreed on appointing a new CEO. Danielle tilted her head slightly. A small gesture, but the board felt it. What is she calculating? Robert said. We would like to appoint Patricia Monroe, former COO in the aviation sector, as Skyline's new CEO. And that was the plot twist no one in the boardroom knew about. Danielle and Patricia had already spoken. They had planned for this moment. Danielle knew Skyline needed more than reform. It needed someone at the helm who was not afraid to bleed for real change. Danielle asked slowly. What conditions did Patricia set? Robert did not hide it. She agreed on 3 conditions. Skyline signs the Carter Shield contract under the new terms. Skyline adopts the Carter standards. And you, Ms. Carter, personally support her appointment. Danielle looked into the eyes of each board member, even through a 2-dimensional screen. Her gaze forced several of them to look away. Then she said, Patricia Monroe is the right choice. Skyline has never had a leader who understands the truth the way she does. She has my support. The room exhaled as one a collective breath so quiet they were afraid Danielle might hear it. Robert nodded. Then we proceed. But Danielle was not finished. There is one more thing. Head snapped up. Danielle said, "You will announce the Carter standards in your press release this afternoon. If you do not, I will announce them first." 1 second. 2. No one dared breathe. They understood. She had the power to break them or save them, and whichever she chose, they could not stop it. Robert King nodded the polished image of the successful chairman, stripped away. "We understand. We will announce them exactly as you require." Danielle closed her laptop and stood. "Then we are done with the first phase." "The first phase," one executive blurted out. Danielle looked straight ahead, her voice light as air yet heavy as stone. "Yes. The first phase of reform. The next phase is oversight." She bowed her head slightly and ended the call. The screen went dark. The board of Skyline sat motionless, feeling as if they had just survived a storm without ever having a map. Evan turned to Danielle, eyes blazing. "You did it! The Carter standards are going to become the industry benchmark." But Danielle didn't celebrate. She looked instead toward the window in her mind, where clouds reflected the growing sunlight. "Evan," she said quietly, "they still do not understand." "Understand what he asked," Danielle replied. "Understand that this is not my story. It is the story of millions, and I will not let Skyline walk away thinking they did me a favor." She turned and walked toward the suite door. "Get the next phase ready," she said. "We have a long day ahead of us." That afternoon, the San Francisco sky hung heavy and gray, as if even the weather were waiting for a verdict. But inside the 42nd floor of Skyline American Airlines headquarters, the atmosphere was far heavier than the clouds outside. The entire board sat frozen like chess pieces, waiting for an unseen hand to move them. Except the hand was not unseen. It had a name: Danielle Carter. 2:03 p.m. The glass doors of the conference room opened. Patricia Monroe, the woman who would become Skyline's next CEO, walked in with the poise of a general, returning from one battle and preparing to enter an even larger one. She wore a navy suit, crisp collar eyes, sharp like someone who had already seen the rot inside the corporate machine down to its bones. The board rose unevenly, some out of respect, some out of fear, and some because they no longer had any other choice. "Let's begin," Patricia said, her voice low, firm, and weighted with authority. On the far wall, the large screen displayed Danielle Carter on video, the light from her window casting a calm but dangerous glow across her face. Evan and Monique stood behind her, like the two arms of an unbreakable strategy. This was no longer a meeting. This was a hearing for an entire corporate culture. Patricia opened the session. "The Carter standards have been approved by the board. Let me be clear, this is not just a new policy. This is a cultural restructuring. If anyone feels this does not align with them, the door is open." An older executive coughed, masking his discomfort. Another clenched his pen so tightly his knuckles whitened. The room could almost hear the cracking of the old guard breaking. Robert King looked at Danielle through the screen. "Ms. Carter, we have signed the full commitment. The Carter standards will be implemented immediately." Danielle did not answer right away. She examined the faces of the Skyline board, letting them feel what words could never convey responsibility. Then she nodded just once, but it was enough to make the entire room exhale. "Good," Danielle said. "Now we move to the contract." Evan lifted the documents toward the camera. Patricia received the printed copy from her assistant. White pages, black ink, $250 million and dozens of binding terms. But the most important thing was not the number. It was the signature that would set off a domino effect across the entire aviation industry. Patricia placed her pen down. "Before signing, I want to say something." Every head lifted. Skyline American has been making mistakes for years, and without Ms. Carter's courage and persistence, those mistakes would still be hidden. The Carter standards are not about one passenger who was discriminated against. They are for everyone who has endured in silence, and for everyone who will fly our skies in the future. She signed. It was not ink on paper. It was a declaration. Then came Danielle. She picked up a pen, but she was not looking at the document. She was looking at the room of executives, staring back at her through the screen, stiff and small, like children being called by name. "Let me be clear," Danielle said. "I am not signing because Skyline deserves it. I am signing because the change you just agreed to is necessary for millions of passengers, and because Patricia has the courage to carry it out." Then she signed. Her stroke was firm, deliberate, and deep, as if she were cutting the last ties between Skyline and its broken past. The sound of her pen hitting paper echoed in the room like a verdict. The $250 million deal was now real. But Skyline understood this was not their victory. This was their last chance not to collapse. Just as the signed contract was placed on the table, the PR assistant's phone on silent mode began vibrating violently. She checked it, then went pale. Big news. Cascade Pacific Airlines just announced they will adopt the Carter standards across their entire system. The Skyline board felt the slap instantly. Patricia allowed herself a small smile. Danielle's lips curved slightly as well. Robert King stammered, They announced before we did." Danielle answered, "Opportunity doesn't wait for Skyline. Others will take it if you do not move fast. A clean hit." Right then, the IT assistant brought up a second screen. Major news sites were already running headlines. Cascade Pacific becomes the first airline to officially adopt the Carter standards. Skyline falls behind. Market awaits. Skyline response. Has the Carter Shield deal been signed? Every executive turned to Patricia. But she did not flinch. She did not panic. She stood, straightened her blazer like someone preparing to step onto a Broadway stage. "Get press conference ready," Patricia ordered. "Skyline will announce the Carter standards today. And we will announce the partnership with Carter Shield within 45 minutes. Robert protested. "Isn't that too soon?" "We haven't prepared," Patricia cut him off. Prepared. The only thing Skyline needs to prepare is honesty. Danielle smiled. She liked this woman. Patricia Danielle said, "If needed, Carter Shield can send a media team to support." Patricia shook her head. "No. Skyline needs to face the public on its own and take responsibility on its own." The two women looked at each other through the screen, two leaders standing at opposite ends of the country, but on the same battlefield. A rare moment of powerful female alliance. 8 p.m. The press conference began. Lights illuminated the Skyline logo as if exposing every crack in its past. Dozens of journalists crowded together, cameras clicking endlessly. Some live-streamed the event view counts, rising from thousands to hundreds of thousands. Patricia stepped to the podium. She read no script. She did not glance at a teleprompter. She looked straight into the lens and said, "Skyline American has failed to treat all passengers fairly. And today we take responsibility." The room fell silent. "We officially accept the Carter standards. We will publish our data. We will reform our culture. We will rebuild Skyline into an airline. Passengers do not just choose to fly, but trust. Cameras flashed. Reporters whispered. Social media exploded. Evan stood beside Danielle watching the live stream, his heart pounding like war drums. "You did it," he whispered. But Danielle looked at Patricia, then at the Carter standards resting on the table. "Evan," she said, "this is only the beginning." 3:22 p.m. The news spread like wildfire. Skyline adopts the Carter standards. $250 million contract signed. Largest cultural reform in U.S. aviation. Begins. Immediately the market responded. SLA plus 2.1%. SLA plus 3.7%. SLA plus 5.2%. As if the market had finally released the breath it had been holding for 24 hours. As if Skyline had finally chosen the right side. Evan chuckled softly. "They're more afraid of losing money than they are of changing," Danielle replied. "As long as they change." 3:41 p.m. Danielle's phone buzzed. A message from Grace Lynn, CEO of Cascade Pacific. "Congratulations. We just began changing an entire industry." Danielle smiled, not the smile of victory, but the smile of someone who has opened the door to something much bigger. She looked out the window. San Francisco's sky had cleared. And she said softly, as if speaking to the sky itself, "Now let's fly." 6 weeks after the earthquake called the Carter standards, the American sky was no longer the same. Not because airlines had changed their logos or added a few pretty slogans, but because passengers, those anonymous people who used to move through airports with guarded eyes, had started to believe they were finally being seen. And that had more power than any PR campaign of the past decade. Chicago O'Hare International Airport, 7:12 a.m. Danielle Carter rolled her black leather-handled suitcase through O'Hare with the stride of someone who had never belonged to the shadows. But today, she was doing something she rarely did, flying under her legal married name, Danielle Henderson, a name she almost never used in business. It was not to hide who she was. It was to test the system to see whether Skyline had truly changed or had only learned how to say the right words. The premium check-in counters were washed in clean white LED light. The staff stood straight, their smiles warm and genuine instead of stiff and trained. "Good morning, Mr. Henderson. We are honored to have you on our flight to New York." No one looked her up and down. No one asked for extra documents. No one doubted her. She gave a small nod. A small step, but the right step. She passed through security. No one spoke down to her. No one hinted that she might be in the wrong line. Danielle's heartbeat slowed, not from relief, but from something rarer. Hope. Hope that real change might truly begin with the smallest things. First Class Lounge, 7:32 a.m. Danielle had just set her laptop on the table when a familiar voice sounded behind her. "Ms. Carter." She turned. It was Carolyn, the flight attendant, who had once pushed everything over the edge on flight SA 482. Today she wore a new uniform, a new badge, and a new expression. The defensive arrogance was gone, replaced by the humility of someone who had been forced to look straight at her own mistakes. "Thank you for giving me a chance to make things right," Caroline said, her voice a little rough. "I wanted you to know I teach in the new training program, and I have learned more than I ever thought I would." Danielle looked into her eyes. No judgment, no accusation, real reform. Danielle replied, "It's not about punishment. It is about changing hearts." Caroline bowed her head slightly, with a gratitude that did not come easily. Then she walked away, leaving Danielle with a feeling she had not allowed herself to fully feel in years. Trust. Boarding for Skyline flight Essay 148, 8:05 a.m. As Danielle approached the boarding door, the unexpected happened. Not because someone stopped her, not because someone looked at her the wrong way, but because of a little girl's voice behind her. "Mom, that is really her." Danielle turned. A brown-skinned girl of about 8 or 9 eyes, wide and bright as stars, was clutching her mother's hand and pointing at Danielle with unfiltered awe. The mother, with curly hair and the tired posture of someone who worked too hard, hurried to pull the girl's hand down. "Zoe, we do not point at people." But Danielle smiled. "It is all right." She knelt so she was at Zoe's eye level. "You know who I am." The girl nodded so hard it seemed her whole body moved her eyes, holding an entire galaxy. "Mum said you are the one who made the airlines change, so people like us do not get treated badly anymore." The mother bit her lip, her eyes starting to fill. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Not everyone uses their power to help other people." Danielle gently squeezed Zoe's hand. "Do you like airplanes?" The girl lit up. "Yes. I want to be a pilot or run an airline." Danielle took a fresh business card from her wallet. It was not her public CEO card, but one with a private email only a few people had. She wrote a few words on it and handed it to Zoe. "When the time comes, send me an email. I will open the first door for you." The mother lifted a hand to her mouth, overcome. Zoe held the card as if it were treasure. That moment, simple and small as it was, seemed to light up the entire space. This was why she fought. Not to win a contract, not to take down an airline, but to repair a world that had been far too willing to forget about the children who were watching. First-class cabin, Boit, 17 a.m. Danielle settled into her seat. Still the same old 2A. But today no one tried to take it. No one questioned it. No one asked for extra ID. A flight attendant approached with an easy, natural smile. "Welcome, Ms. Henderson. Would you like orange juice or champagne?" Danielle glanced out the window, where sunlight spilled across the silver fuselage, reflecting a clear blue sky, like a promise. "Orange juice, please." "And thank you." The attendant smiled. "It is our responsibility, ma'am, not a favor." That line, short and gentle as it was enough to make Danielle close her eyes for a brief second, because that was the final meaning of the Carter Standards. New York City ceremony. 1:14 p.m. Hundreds of guests packed into the airplane hangar at JFK. A brand-new Boeing 787 stood gleaming under the lights, painted with the skyline and Carter Shield logos, entwined like the emblem of a new era. Patricia Monroe took the stage first. Her voice was strong and decisive. Today is not just about a technology partnership. Today is Skyline American's promise. Under this sky, everyone is first class. Applause rolled through the hangar like waves. Danielle walked up next. The lights hit her so hard that some cameras overexposed, but her face did not falter. She was used to that light. Not the light of a stage, the light of truth. 6 weeks ago, Danielle said, "I experienced what millions have gone through in silence." Today, I am not just standing here as a CEO. I am standing here as a passenger, as a citizen, as someone who believes respect is a right, not a privilege. The entire hangar fell utterly still. No breath was wasted, no gaze wandered. The Carter Standards are not the benchmark for a single airline. They are a benchmark for a fairer world. Behind her, Patricia's eyes blazed. Danielle ended with a line that was quiet, but rolled like thunder. "We are not changing the sky. We are changing how people are treated under it." The applause erupted like a ground-level explosion, crashing up against the steel ceiling of the hangar. 7:56 p.m. back in Chicago. Danielle stood at an airport window, watching new Skyline aircraft lift off the runway. They climbed higher, as if carrying a message with them. Evan stood beside her, hands in his pockets, his expression more serious than usual. "You have done something no CEO has dared to do," he said. "You used power to lift other people up." Danielle smiled without looking at him. "I did not do it alone. There are people willing to change with me." Evan studied her for a moment, then asked softly, "So what is the next step?" Danielle gazed up at the star-filled sky, her eyes seeming to cut through the clouds into a future still far ahead. "The next step. We do what the system never believed a black woman could do." Evan raised an eyebrow. "What is that?" Danielle turned to him, her eyes proud, steady, and blazing. "We build the new standard, not just for the sky, for every system that ever tried to push us to the margins." The wind moved across the tarmac. The distant announcements echoed through the terminal. The night sky opened like a map of endless possibilities. And the story of Danielle Carter, the woman who had once been underestimated on an ordinary flight, now rewriting the rules of an entire industry, was far from over. It had only just taken off. From the perspective of an expert in organizational culture and leadership, Danielle Carter's story shows that true power does not lie in authority or money, but in the ability to stand up, demand fairness, and change the system when faced with injustice. When someone dares to use their intelligence, strategy, and influence to protect their dignity, they not only achieve results for themselves, but also set a new standard for the entire industry. This story reminds us that the most important thing is not revenge or flaunting power, but creating a long-lasting positive impact. If you find this story inspiring, like the video, to spread the message about fairness and effective leadership, subscribe so you do not miss real stories of courage, influence, and systemic change. And before you go, comment 3 words: stand up.